Välkommen allesammans. Today we are speaking about the Norse Pagan Temples and what the sources say about those. The big question is, are they indoor? Are they outdoor? Are they kind of an open air hybrid? This is the kind of thing that, it's really a bit unclear about what did the pagan temples actually look like. In this video, I'm just going over what the written sources say because I'm going to do another one about the archaeological finds and evidence of temples there. And the reason I'm not doing that in this video is because it's a bit difficult and conflicting and it's just going to take way too long. Archaeologists, they like to make it seem like they've found something more significant than they actually have most of the time. And a lot of these buildings that they're finding, they end up calling them temples, but most of them are probably not, and most of them are probably halls for feasting. And these could have been, near the temples for sure, but the temples and sacred spaces where the religious practices were actually practiced, that was out in nature somewhere, and you'll see what I mean in just a minute. So again, these are just the written sources. Archaeological evidence I will do in another video coming soon, and this might be a little bit of a long video, so I'm going to organize it in chapters because I'm going over every source. First description we have of temple is, let's just get the earliest and most famous one out of the way. That's Tacitus Germania, who's a Roman historian that writes about the Germanic peoples, and he said that they had no temples. They worshiped their gods out in nature. But he kind of conflicts himself in this very same work, Germania. He writes that there is a temple out on an island at sea, and it's dedicated to the Mother Earth, or Earth Goddess. It's not a built temple, really, but it's more of a sacred forest. But they do have some little small setup structures there, it seems. Then in another one of Tacitus's work is the Annals. He writes about the Romans who slaughtered the Germanic tribe, the Marsi, while they were asleep and drunk and celebrating a festival near Tamfana. Horrible bastards, they killed women and children there too. But anyway, Tamfana, translated, means temples of Tam. Who is Tam? A god? A long story, don't get me started, but yeah, here it seems like there was actually a temple there because the Roman soldiers did tear it down, as he wrote in his Annals there. Was it a building? Don't know. Open air? Probably. Enclosed area? Statues? Or maybe even just a stone circle or a big altar? Maybe, who knows. But one point that I will make is that in this passage it's clear that the festival was not at the temple. It was near a temple. So the party and the feast is away from the sacred space, and this is something really important that you have to know and remember, as other sources are going to confirm too. So that is by far the oldest source we have, at a time where there was probably very, very little difference between the Germanic peoples, a long time before the Viking Age. So let's fast forward quite a bit more in time, and we have the second source, and that's the Royal Frankish Annals. Another bastard invading force, Charlemagne and the Franks, they came to the famous Irminsul and destroyed the temple there. What exactly was this temple? A big tree trunk, or a big tree, a pillar, a stone temple, a building? We really don't know. Only thing that is clear is that it was massive, damn massive, whatever it was there, as other sources confirm too. And the fact that it says here that Charlemagne wanted to stay for a few days to destroy the temple completely, but he had to leave early because there was no water for his troops to drink. So that means whatever it was, an army, a full army of probably thousands of Frankish soldiers could not bring down the temple in a day or two. So whatever it was there, it would have been massive and sturdy, not a basic wooden hof. An army could have brought down, a building or many buildings pretty quickly, or a tree. So it must have been really massive. I'll share one thing. We're not 100% sure about this, but we think Irminsul was at this location in the Teutoburger Wald in Germany, and that was called the Ecksternsteine. And you see it's still here. It's still here today. And this is what it looks like, after Christians have probably been chopping away at it for 1,200 years, so imagine what it might have been before that. Anyway, source number 3, this is from Rudolf of Fulda, and this is a bishop who also writes about this Irminsul site, but there is no temple there at this time. This is This is about 70 years after Charlemagne came there and made the first destructions of it, but the Saxons still worshipped Irminsul at this place. So Charlemagne didn't destroy the temple there completely 70 years before, but at some point during that time, before this was written, someone did come to destroy whatever structure may have been there, but it was still a place of worship. So the temple, or whatever building or structure that was there, it was not the sacred part that was important to this. The sacred space was the nature there. If you want to know what I believe, I think that this Eksternsteiner was Irminsul. There might have been temples and buildings and sacred trees there for sure, but Charlemagne could destroy all those in a couple hours, but they couldn't have destroyed this massive rock pillar so easily. They probably used tools and chisels and anything they had to try and destroy it and take big chunks out of it. Yeah, they couldn't bring the whole thing down. They would continue to chop little parts out of it over the next few hundred years, but the thing here that is here today, what still stands, is probably just a fraction of what it was originally. I think it was just one massive pillar reaching up hundreds of meters into the sky. It already reaches, I think it's about 30-40 meters tall, so that's now after it's been halfway destroyed. So that's what I think Irminsul was anyway. Source number 4 about temples is the Chronicon of Thietmar of Merseburg. Here, Thietmar describes sacrifices held every 9 years at Lejre. So here, no temple is mentioned. We do know that Lejre, it's in Denmark. It was a political and religious center with many buildings there, and they uncovered a few of these buildings actually in archaeological digs, but it might have been temples there originally, but probably not, as I mentioned earlier. I'll go over those in another video. But as usual, the temple, the sacred place, is the nature around it. It's probably the grove that sits just west of the village at Lejre. So that's probably there too. Now, before I get into the final and most detailed description of a Norse temple, here are just a few notable mentions. There are quite a few mentions in the sagas and other sources about temples, but none of them give a real clear description, but I'm putting them up here anyway. Egir Saga just says Norway. The main and biggest temple was at a place called Gaular. In Ynglinga Saga, it also seems to be a building there that's a temple, but the blóð seems like it was practiced outside in this story, and then they moved it to the feast inside afterwards. Then you have Hervarar Saga. This also definitely seems to be a temple there, but the religious activities were being practiced outside, where the king's daughter Alfhildur was reddening the Hörgr with blood. Then we have Håkon the Good Saga. Now this is the only source we have where the altar and sacrifice takes place all indoors, when blood was splattered all over the altar, all over the temple walls, inside and outside. So was this kind of indoors like a building? Don't know. It doesn't really say. In my opinion, it would have probably been like an open air type of thing. Compare it to like a Greek temple, most likely. I think that would look more like this than a feast hall. Anyway, I'm showing you here also a few clips from the Poetic Edda. I think the reason for all this confusion about exactly what a temple is just poor translations over the last 1,000 years, and also bad interpretations from Christian writers. I mean, just look at how they translate Hörgr and Hof. Sometimes Hörgr is a big pile of rocks, sometimes they say shrine, sometimes temple, and then Hof is sometimes translated as a temple, but really throughout history a Hof is clearly just a communal building, like a feast or a drinking hall. So to me, I think that there are 3 separate elements to any Norse pagan temple or like kind of religious centered area, and I'll tell you exactly why in just a minute. But on to the last and final source, and this is the most detailed description of a pagan temple, and this is Adam of Bremen. So I'm putting it all up here. It's a bit of a long text. These are just some summaries that I'm speaking about. First, Adam of Bremen describes the Saxons and how they worshipped. And the first thing that jumps out here is they don't confine their gods to temples or mold them into human form like the Romans did. Also here it speaks about Irminsul. Just keep in mind that Adam of Bremen lived about 300 years after our little Charlemagne incident when they destroyed Irminsul, and Adam was writing based on old sources that he had read. So the Saxons at this time were not pagan anymore, not out in the open at least. I think they definitely were in private, but that's a subject for another video. Then also in Adam of Bremen's account is the famous description of the temple at Uppsala, which most of you have probably heard of. Here there is a mysterious tree that is green all year round. There's a sacred spring nearby, like a well or some body of water. Also writes how there's a golden chain around the temple, and there was, gold decked out all over the walls. So the reliability and description of this account is always questioned because of things like this. Not going to get into it now, but this idea of an enclosure, it does seem like temples or sacred spaces were enclosed by something. It could be a chain or a fence or pillars or poles or things like that, and archaeology helps back that up as well. So this idea of an enclosed space is probably a key trait of a Norse temple. There were also statues here of Thor, Odin, Freyr. Very interesting because he specifically said that the Saxons did not make statues of their god, and that's 300 years before. But here, in the late 11th century, the Swedes did. So it does look like these statues and idols were a part of later Norse paganism, but for sure it was not a part of all of our original Germanic paganism. Then finally, it's pretty clear that they had the sacrifices in the sacred groves, just near the temple. So here we go again. We see the same thing that I've always been saying in this video. The temples are not the buildings. The sacred places are the temples. Here it's a spring or a grove and a sacred tree that were the key points of worship. That's where the sacrifices and other religious activities happened. That's also probably where the hörger, the altars, were set up. And yes, it's very possible that there would be an enclosure and possibly even a little shelter around that sacred place, but it wouldn't be a feasting hall. The hove, that is the feasting hall. That's where we see in a lot of these texts, and this is not a temple. It's a drinking or feasting hall near the actual temple or sacred space. Look, the sacred space would have been kept sacred, That's where the sacrifices and religious practices would have taken place, at the sacred spaces in nature. This is where the spirits and the gods would be summoned and an offering given to nature. This is not where the feast would have been. Think about it. There would have been thousands of people coming to these places sometimes. Once a year, the whole country would have come to these temples and sacred places. They would be pissing and shitting and throwing up from the booze and partying. They would not be doing this in the middle of their most sacred place in nature. So here I'm showing you a little map that I made just to give you an idea of what a religious site might have looked like to the Germanic tribes originally. So this is just a grove, a map of a random grove, and for example here might be the central place that they deemed holy. Maybe it was a spring or a well or a sacred tree or something like that, and it would be in the middle of a grove or somewhere near that, whatever. And that is where they would build the hörger. This is where they would construct the altar with a pile of stones. It's very possible that this pile of stones would have had some sort of enclosure around it, or even a shelter. In a couple sources, we do see that the hörger possibly had some sort of wooden tent, teepee-looking thing over it. But very often it might have been enclosed like this. We see, examples of this not just in Scandinavia, but all over Europe in different formats. So we can definitely call these types of things a temple, but really it's like an open-air religious site. That's the main focus. Then it's very possible that a traditional temple sometimes might have been set up with statues of the gods and other things. This would be nearby that sacred place, like we see in a couple sources. This was probably not something done originally for the Germanic peoples, but later on in time in Scandinavia. It does actually seem like those types of things started to pop up. And this would be more like a traditional temple that we all think of, like indoors with shrines and figures and idols set up to the gods. Of course, because Scandinavia was cold, a Scandinavian temple is not going to look the same as a Greek temple, just a difference in weather. But this kind of temple would still be a part of nature that you would come to and then leave when it was time. It was not some place for humans to take over. It was a place for nature to own, and humans just came there and gave their offerings for a little bit. Then finally, off somewhere away from the sacred place would be the Hof, or many Hofs, most likely for the bigger places. This is where the feast would happen, and this was where they would go after the sacrifice, and that would be all the toasts and sumbel and maybe some other religious practices like that, but the offering and main ceremony would not be taking place in the Hof. That would be happening in nature at that sacred place. It was an offering to nature, so whatever offerings were left there, the animals, birds, insects, whatever, nature has to have a way to absorb it. Nature is not even going to be able to get to the offering if you're drinking and pissing and shitting and partying for 3 to 9 days in a row like we see in most of these festivals. That's how long they lasted. So just think of it like that. This is an example of how a religious site would have looked, but we only have sources for about 5 of these places. So these would have been, the main ones of a country and the largest ones, but really they would only be visited once every year or maybe even once every 9 years. But there were probably hundreds of more sacred places all over the Germanic and European world of varying sizes and importance. So no matter where you are, I'm sure there's a sacred place that you could consider a Norse pagan temple. And what makes these places sacred exactly? Well, I'm going to speak about that in the next video because that's very interesting. But that's all I'll say for today. Vi ses nästa gång.